Hello and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. And today we're looking back the way, all the way 10 years ago. And of course it was 10 years ago this week that the Scottish independence referendum took place. Alex and I are 10 years older, not necessarily 10 years wiser. But before, Alex, we get into the political consequences and the electoral consequences of the referendum, what were your sort of referendum highlights covering this as a journalist?
Well, I bought a house as a result of the, the referendum. Well, a modest flat in Edinburgh. And actually, we moved in the week before the referendum, so it was a fairly chaotic time. From a professional point of view, I think there is little disputing the fact that the 2 years or so of the independence referendum was the most extraordinary single period in our political and journalistic careers. It was a time unlike any other, and to a certain extent, I think that explains why people have been so reluctant to move on from it, or at least so many people have been reluctant to move on from the referendum, because journalistically, people want to recapture that. So there's an inbuilt bias in journalism towards big dramatic events, and the referendum fit that bill. And so people, I think, within the media have actually found it quite difficult to move on from the referendum, because nothing will ever really compare with it or stand comparison with it, because it was bigger, more dramatic, more consequential than any other event in Scottish political history in living memory, I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first big event was the 5th of August, 2014. That's when Salmond Darling, the debate took place, which I hosted. It was 2 hours of live television. Of course, it was a debate which was won comprehensively by Alistair Darling and got the Better Together campaign off to a really, really good start. My memory of that evening, actually, was that with a couple of minutes to on air, and the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, this was a sort of theatre, and each of these leaders were either side of the stage. And I went stage left, where Alex Salmond was seated with his special advisor, Duncan Hamilton. And normally Alex Salmond, when he sees you, he'll slap you in the back, ask you how you're doing, all that kind of stuff. And the first thing that I noticed was that his body language was incredibly tight, most unlike Alex Salmond. And at that point I thought, he's nervous. And then I went to the other side of the stage where Alistair Darling was, and he was sort of like running on the spot, almost as if he needed to go to the bathroom. And he said, "How long have we got to on air? How long have we got?" Looked at my watch, I said, "We're about a minute to on air." And I thought, he's nervous too. I better start getting nervous. And that was my sort of main memory of the night. It was probably the most on edge that I was ever in sort of 34 years of broadcasting at STV. The other thing that I remember, and it preceded this debate, was going to the offices of Better Together to see Blair McDougall and Rob Shothouse, taking the managing director of the broadcast division at STV and the head of news and current affairs. Well, they were absolutely incandescent. They were literally bawling and shouting at us because in relation to the date of this programme, they had effectively accused us of being in cahoots with Alex Salmond's team, which was utter rubbish. But sometimes, this is what happens in campaigns where the stakes are high. People do get very, very tense. Needless to say, everything was smoothed over. The event took place, and the irony of ironies was that the Better Together man won the debate.
Yes, that was the debate in which Alistair Darling said, brought up the currency issue and really sunk Salmond on the currency issue. What is your plan B? You don't have a plan B. Your plan A isn't going to work. Salmond now says, well, then at the subsequent BBC debate, I had a better night and I won that, and it was watched by more people, so it was more consequential. But I don't think it was. I think you're right that the STV debate that you chaired was much more consequential. It wasn't necessarily the defining or decisive moment in the campaign, but it was a very significant one. You asking about sort of personal reflections and so on. Here's a thing that I recall that I think gives some indication into how the broader Yes campaign saw itself. I remember being canvassed by a couple of young, enthusiastic, desperately keen, lovely Yes campaigners, and they knocked on the door, checked your details and so on, asked, how are you going to vote? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I suspect I'm going to be voting no. I mean, I've, sort of written a column saying that, so I kind of better stick to it. And they said, well, that's disappointing to hear. But so on a scale of 0 to 10, how certain is it that you're going to vote no? And I said, well, you can put down whatever you like. I mean, I know what the answer to that is, but it's going to disappoint you. So they said, well, could we put you down as a 6 then? In other words, put me down basically as a floating voter. And I said, sure, if that's what you want to do. I mean, the true answer is probably a 9 or a 10. But they were determined to hear what they wanted to hear. And so they put me down basically as somebody who might well change their mind. And I couldn't help but think, well, this is just one canvas, obviously. It's just a pair of canvases knocking on a single flat door and so on. But I couldn't help but wonder, is this pattern being repeated across the country? Is the Yes campaign hearing what it wants to hear from voters rather than what voters are actually saying? And I had a slight suspicion that, it seemed improbable that it was just these two, as I say, very lovely, enthusiastic young canvassers and so on who were guilty of wanting to find what they wanted to discover, regardless of what people were telling them. And I think that reflects a sense in which the Yes campaign almost got carried away with itself in the latter stages of the campaign, I think. Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, are both on record as saying that they were absolutely convinced they were going to win and that the thought of defeat never entered their mind. Salmond, in his book, The Dream Shall Never Die, which I would add is one of the worst books of its type I've ever had the misfortune of reading, he gives the impression that he never met anyone who was going to vote no throughout the campaign. And so, the Yes campaign believed its own hype, I think, which is one reason why the result was so crushing for them, because they genuinely thought they were going to win. And so I'd ask you this, Bernard, do you think they should have won?
I think that the comments which they were making at that time was a reflection of what they were picking up on the doorsteps. But, just before I went into studio to present the results program, which in theory could have been the most exciting results program that I had ever chaired. And of course, it turned out to be a damp squib, because when Clackmannanshire came through, and Clackmannanshire was Scotland in miniature, and it went no by the margin it did, we knew at that point that the game was up for the Yes campaign. Indeed, I think Alex Salmond then started drawing up his resignation statement, which he gave the following day. But just before I went into studio, Jim Sillars was in the building, because he was one of the guests in the green room, people that we were going to talk to during the night. And he said to me, we are going to win this. This is going to happen. Now, Jim specifically, during the course of the referendum, had gone very, very specifically into working class communities, into council schemes where he would make speeches on top of a bus and then speak to voters. And he was reflecting the experience that he was seeing on the ground. Now, it's not surprising in a sense that that's what he was picking up, because that kind of demographic were breaking in some parts of the country quite heavily for Yes. But it comes back to a point that the late Winnie Ewing once said when she was interviewed by Lou Gardner on the Hamilton by-election, not actually the Hamilton by-election in 67, but the by-election in 78, where George Robertson managed to see off a challenge from Margot MacDonald. And Winnie Ewing said that all candidates in elections suffer from winning-itis. They think they're winning even when they are not. And of course, the stampede for Yes in some communities was more than counterbalanced by the stampede of the middle classes in other parts of the country, where in places like East Renfrewshire and East Dunbartonshire, we were getting turnouts of 91% in one local authority area 91.5% in the other local authority area. Quite astonishing. So my memory of Jim saying this is going to happen, well, pretty early on in the night, we knew that it wasn't.
Absolutely. And you're right about the turnout there. I mean, across Scotland, it was around almost 85%. But in Glasgow, turnout was 75%. And so, in Glasgow voted yes, much more narrowly, obviously, than, say, Edinburgh voted no, but still a very significant victory, an essential victory for the Yes campaign. But clearly, the turnout differential, broadly speaking, favoured the No campaign in the end. And, there were a lot of people who voted no, but did so quite quietly. And they weren't sort of shouting or singing their no from the rooftops in the same way that the Yes campaign was. And the two campaigns differed very significantly, didn't they? I mean, the Yes campaign was a sort of a journey of democratic wish fulfillment in some ways. Everybody's reasons for voting yes might be very different from somebody else's reasons, but it didn't matter because these were all a kind of sort of personal epiphany, a personal revelation. Whereas the No campaign was much more sort of timid, cautious. It seemed pinched and crabbed and unimaginative, but it was also based on a quite profound and subsequently correct understanding that the target audience, the people who were going to make the difference in the referendum, were not interested in poetry. They were not interested in hymns to the glories of the Union or its history or even its future. They were very much transactional voters. They wanted to know about economic security, the balance of risk, appeals to sort of British sentiment had no impact on them whatsoever, indeed were possibly counterproductive. And so that, I think, explains why the Better Together campaign received so much criticism, because it wasn't actually very interested in talking to people who were always going to vote no. And as a result, it didn't really give very many people who were voting no happy, good reasons for voting no, but it did relentlessly target the economically anxious, the economically cautious sector of the electorate. And, when you come back to, the final result, I think, it's difficult to say that Blair McDougall and Alistair Darling and the others in the Better Together campaign necessarily got it wrong, because I don't think there was ever any prospect that no was going to win with 65, 70% of the vote.
Well, I would say that the campaigns there was a great contrast in the campaigns in terms of the atmosphere. Many of the people in the Yes campaign, and this is something which more or less they all say, is that the energy was amazing, and they'll say this was the most profound expression of democracy ever in our history, because for them, it was not just a political exercise. I think for many of them, there was a big emotional investment in that as well. But the flip side of the coin was that many people who did not wish to see Scottish independence, they went with this as the biggest exercise of democracy in Scottish political history. There was a palpable fear on the part of many people who were voting no, because they looked at the economic arguments and they said, this is not only a risk, but if this happens, we will be succeeding to an enormous deficit on day one. The public expenditure figures, where it's identifiable public expenditure per head of population, is higher in Scotland. It all completely goes. How are we going to sustain our public services in an independent Scotland? Some people were even talking, if this goes yes, I'm moving house, and I'm moving house south of the border. I can remember just at the level of friends, if we were having people round to dinner, because you did get a situation where everybody around the dinner table all believed in the same thing. Half of them would have been on one side of the argument, and the other half were on the other side of the argument. And I used to say to anyone who was round here for drinks or dinner, you've got 10 minutes to talk about this, and then we're banning it. We're banning it for the rest of the evening, because one of the reasons was that, even within families, where there were people who were split in this. The one thing that I think, at the level of what you might call the pub talk, it wasn't very temperate and it wasn't very respectful. Some of it really got really very, very edgy indeed. And I think it took quite a long time, actually, after the referendum for, if you like, the tone that some people were employing, and I'd say some people, I don't mean everybody, but the tone that some people took during the referendum, it took really a long number of years, actually, for that to completely dissipate.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, and you will too, obviously, the saltire waving hordes descending on the BBC studios in Glasgow to protest against the BBC's coverage of the referendum, to demand that Nick Robinson, then the political editor of the BBC, be sacked. And Alex Salmond said that this was a civic and joyous demonstration of popular protest. Well, yeah, sure, fine. That may have been how he felt it, or how he saw it. But there were a lot of people in Scotland who were appalled by this sort of stuff, who thought that this is a demonstration that actually Scottish nationalism is not so very different from other brands of nationalism in Europe, when you boil it down to it, when the stakes are really, really high. And there were a lot of people, you're absolutely right, on the no campaign, on the no side of the fence and so on, who viewed the whole campaign as something that was desperately upsetting, because many of these people had a definite British component to their identity, and they felt that this was being put at risk, that this would be taken from them, that the country of which they are part and have no problems with was going to be dismembered. That the stakes were extremely high, and so it was not a particularly friendly referendum for them. The rise of social media obviously played a part in that. I mean, it is remarkable how being called a quisling and so on tends to turn people off the idea of Scottish independence. It doesn't make you warm to those who advocate for it. You're absolutely right. There were families, and again, we all know these, and so where relationships were put under extreme strain by the referendum arguments, and you had a sort of tacit.
Some marriages as well.
Absolutely. You then had this sort of tacit agreement that we are not going to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the BBC, I think, had a very, very difficult referendum. I mean, I can share with you a story. I was actually out on Byers Road filming with the late Charles Kennedy, and I got a phone call, and it was the day of the hydro debate. If you recall, all of these school pupils were bussed in to fill the hydro for a debate that night, and the buses actually had started arriving. They started arriving, I think, late morning, because the recording of this program was, I think, mid-afternoon. And I was told this program might not take place because Better Together had put up George Galloway as one of the panelists. And the Greens were refusing to take part. They were actually refusing to take part. And it looked as if the whole thing might fall apart. So I rushed back to STV, and we sent some cameras just over the river to the hydro to get shots, because I thought the reputational damage that would take place for the BBC if this doesn't take place will be absolutely huge. And of course, I almost half suspect that Better Together deliberately put up George Galloway as one of the panelists in the hope that the other side said, we're not debating with him, and the whole program was going to fall to pieces. But I can recall there were one or two things where national broadcasters were covering this, and they didn't cover themselves in glory, I can remember, and there was a chap from ITN that was sat next to me for the duration of the referendum, and Tom Bradby, at one point in a two-way, referred to the English pound. And I thought, this ain't going to play well. Now, had that been said by the political editor of the BBC, now there was a separate issue with Nick Robinson, as we all know, all hell would have broken loose. And then some days later, and Tom Bradby at one point had been the Ireland correspondent of ITN, and he actually said in a two-way, this seems all very divisive and it's all very bad-tempered. There's almost reminiscences of what used to happen in Ireland. My jaw dropped at this point. I thought, well, nobody's actually killing one another here. It may well be very, very robust debate. And the one thing that I think that it does demonstrate is that the BBC in general have a much tougher job in defending lines than other broadcasters, because you could say that some of the stuff that was coming out from the network commercial broadcaster was more problematic than anything that came out the BBC. But of course, most people were training their in the Yes campaign were training their attentions on the BBC. But the political ramifications, Alex, what do you think they were?
Well, I mean, you had a realignment of Scottish politics in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, obviously. The great surge in SNP membership above 100,000, then the election in 2015, with the SNP winning 56 out of 59 seats. That was helped, I think, by David Cameron's reaction to the referendum result, where, no sooner have the votes been counted and Cameron sort of says, well, we've won a great victory and so on. Now we must settle the English question, English votes for English laws in Parliament and so on. And it was like there was this sort of curious disconnect. And just go back to some of the things you were talking about there. And I think this highlights this as well, that there were a lot of people in London who simply couldn't understand the impulse for yes. The idea of independence, the idea of the breakup of the Union after more than 300 years was simply unthinkable for them. So they didn't actually think about it very much. And that led them to, I think, persistently underestimating the power of the Yes campaign, the power of the Yes idea. Because, there's always been, I think, a latent acceptance that independence, all things being equal, could be quite an attractive idea. The challenge for people advocating independence has always been to persuade people in Scotland that all things are equal now. And that was where the Yes campaign had a number of pieces of good fortune, I think, in 2014, because it was coming off a number of years of buoyant oil revenues, where if you look at the JERS figures from sort of 2010, 2011, 2012, Scotland's deficit was basically the same as the UK's overall deficit. Now, in the years since then, that Scotland's relative fiscal position has declined significantly. So the economic case for independence is much, much harder to advocate now. Not that Scotland would be too poor to be independent, but we would necessarily start from a poorer position that would require spending cuts or tax increases or something, combination of the two. But in 2014, the Yes campaign was able to capitalise on the fact that for a few years, Scotland's fiscal position was basically the same as the UK's. And so it was much closer to answering that question, are all things equal now, than there would have been the case previously or indeed subsequently. So the moment in time for the referendum turned out to be very fortunate, I think, for Alex Salmond. The fact you had a Conservative government in London also helped. The fact you were coming off the great financial crisis, the sense that the UK wasn't working as well as it should, that the UK was sinking, which I think is a necessary precondition for Scotland to float, if you like, because independence then becomes a kind of take to the lifeboats scenario where, okay, that is risky, but it is perhaps not as risky as staying aboard the sinking ship. All of these things coalesced, I think, to favour the Yes campaign. And that continued for quite a number of years. Brexit obviously then has an impact, and immediately you begin to think, well, yes, Scotland voted to remain, UK as a whole has voted to leave. The political argument for yes, for independence is much more straightforward as a result of Brexit, and has a certain amount of coherence and good sense behind it. You can understand why it's appealing. The nature of Brexit, of course, actually ends up hurting the Yes campaign, I think, because Brexit becomes such a mess and so exhausting that it drains enthusiasm for fresh constitutional adventures amongst the people who might have been persuaded that Brexit justified reopening the national question. Because, for a while, the SNP and Yes do get a Brexit bounce, but it is neither as large nor as prolonged as Nicola Sturgeon and others thought it would be.
Yeah, I could not have predicted on the 19th of September that the following year at a general election, the party that was on the losing side in the referendum would win 56 out of 59 seats and would gather effectively 50% of the popular vote. I simply could never have predicted that. I also wouldn't have predicted that it would have led to a modest, but in their context, significant revival for the Scottish Conservatives. And I certainly would not have predicted that electoral politics, and indeed politics more generally, would be seen through the prism of the constitutional question, because, of course, the 18th of September was supposed to, in effect, draw a line under this one way or the other. And the remarkable thing is that it wasn't until the general election earlier this year that we can now say that the constitutional overhang of the 18th of September has finally gone. And yet within that 10-year period, you had this point certainly after 2015, certainly when the SNP was standing at over 120,000 members, where you had all of these troops where, of course, you were into the whole debate about Indy Ref II. It has taken effectively a decade to put that to bed. And it's quite extraordinary that the constitutional overhang of the referendum did hang around quite for as long as it did. And of course, we now have the situation where the Yes movement seemed to get further energy in the circumstances of defeat. And yet 10 years down the line, one has to say that if you look at the spread of individuals arguing for independence and the spread of parties, from the SNP to ALPA to the Greens, to people who are not aligned to any political party, in a sense, the Yes movement is now more divided than at any time in that last 10 years. And therefore, I think that just about everybody thinks that the question is now effectively dead. Following the SNP's most recent conference, suggestions that the pro-independence party should come together to try and hold on to a pro-independence majority at Holyrood in 2026. But given that the record of the SNP in government is now what seems to be the driving force in terms of electoral considerations, they're going to have one really difficult job trying to reignite the constitutional question in 2026. Indeed, I think it's the mainstream view within the SNP that they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, although they have the difficulty that they sort of have to talk about it while not talking about it, if you see what I mean, in as much as they have to have independence as page 1, line 1 of the manifesto, as they did in this general election, to keep their own core support on side, because if the SNP isn't pushing for independence, what fundamentally is the point of the SNP? This is its raison d'etre, its reason for existence. But if you keep wanging on about independence to the exclusion of everything else, then for a lot of other voters for whom independence isn't the pressing dominant issue of the moment, then you begin to look weird and obsessed and interested only in speaking to yourself and your own core support. And I think that is the danger for the SNP, is that it is very difficult to ride both those horses simultaneously and to have a message that is only heard by the people you want to hear it when it comes to, stressing independence, without having the people, who aren't into independence right now also hearing that message. And, there is also then just the factor of time, which kills all governments in the end. The SNP in 2026 will be asking for a third decade in power, which is a statistic or a line to concentrate the mind, I think. And this is, in certain respects, the result was profoundly unsatisfactory, in as much as 55-45 in 2014 was a clear margin, undoubtedly. That is not a knife-edge margin in the end. but it wasn't a sufficiently decisive one. I remember speaking to one of Alex Salmond's closest advisors a few days before the referendum. And I said, well, look, the structural aspect of this is, you guys just need above 40% to keep this issue alive. And he looked at me and had a little smile and nodded and agreed, yes, anything above 40 and we can go again. Now, the difficulty with that is you need permission, and permission from the electorate more broadly. And so you had a situation, I think, in 2011 when the SNP win their majority. We haven't had a referendum on independence. It is reasonable to put the question. The SNP have earned that right. But earning the right to a second referendum on the same question within a decade or so of it being put and answered is a necessarily different thing and a much higher bar to clear. And I think the sense that a second referendum is in some weird sense cheating is felt by quite a lot of people, even if they wouldn't necessarily articulate it in quite that fashion. And you have, therefore, a sense of fatigue, and, it's not fair to keep going on about this, because what is the point of a referendum if its result is rendered meaningless, which is essentially what the Yes campaign has spent the last 10 years saying?
Well, after the most recent general election, I said the SNP had to do two things. The first thing they had to do was to decide what they were going to do with the independence question and decide what their strategy was going to be. And the second thing is that they had to, in policy terms, decide what the offer to voters would be in 2026. Now, they've had their conference, and it appears to me that they haven't answered either of these fundamental questions. Now, to a certain extent, the policy choices will be governed by money, and in that regard, the UK budget on the 30th of October is going to be absolutely critical in determining what fiscal manoeuvrability they have in order to deal with new policies. But on this question, I think there is an acceptance within the party that there is absolutely no point in talking about constitutional politics if constitutional politics is not what is exercising the electorate. But that being said, as you say, the curious position where go-no talk about that to just go-no, whilst at the same time having to have a position on it, because it's fundamentally in the party's DNA. But I don't think that they have resolved this at all. And I think that we're headed in 2026 for possibly the messiest result in the history of the Holyrood Parliament. And as I've said before, it may well be that a combination of two parties in the Parliament post the 26th election can't get to the magic figure of 65, but it would be significant indeed that if you look at the 129 seats, is there a majority for unionist parties in the Parliament as opposed to parties who actually support independence? Because if there is a majority for unionist parties at 2026, I mean, for practical purposes, the independence question is really almost dead. That would actually give it the last rites. What might just kickstart it is if there is a pro-independence majority after 2026. And on the figures, because of the voting system, I simply, at this moment in time, would not put a bet on at all as to whether or not it's going to be a unionist parliament after 2026, or whether or not nationalists in one form or another could get to 65 seats.
No, I agree with that. But I've spent quite a lot of time over the last 10 years sort of suggesting to, unionists, if you like, that it is absolutely, there is not much point in winning in 2014 if you then lose in 2030 or 2034, so you have to bake in or try and build a long-term acceptance for the advantages of the union. And that, I think, can only be done by making Britain seem to work, by having Britain governed well and effectively, and the country being a happier, more successful, prosperous place than it has been for much of the last decade. So that is the long-term challenge for unionism. I mean, you saw John Swinney interviewed by the Sunday Times at the weekend. He would say, well, look at the opinion polls. 60% or so of people under 34 support independence. That is the independence generation. Independence is a matter of historical inevitability. The demographics demonstrate as much. Well, like you, Bernard, I will recall how people have spent a long, long time making the same kind of argument about a united Ireland, that the demographics in Northern Ireland are such that it is just a matter of time. And yet, well, the demographics do change, and yet a united Ireland is just as far away as ever, because the conditions for a border poll are nowhere close to being met. In the same way in Scotland, it is just because people support independence at the age of 22 doesn't necessarily mean they will do so at the age of 35 or 40 or whatever. And so this argument of historical inevitability, so you might as well just get with the program now, which is what the Yes campaign has been reduced to sort of saying, I think is deeply suspect and dubious, because again, you have this thing of it is one thing for people to say, I support independence, it would be a nice idea, I like the sound of it, taking back control, Scotland's future in Scotland's hands, all of this stuff. But there is a difference between that and demanding the right for a referendum now. And it is the reduced salience of the independence question that is the real problem for the SNP, I think, because it is not enough for people to say, yes, I support independence as a theoretical matter, and it's easy to support it when the question isn't being put. If there was actually a live referendum right now, I think it might be much harder for the Yes campaign to hold the 45-47% of the vote that polls currently suggest it has, because I suspect quite a bit of that support is quite soft, it's theoretical, an aspiration perhaps, but that's not the same as a concrete support for the matter if the question was to be put again.
Yeah, I think that political movements should not seek solace in the view of one cynic who said that in politics, where there is death, there is hope. Because people in their early 20s who may well take a position on the constitutional question now, by the time they're in their mid-30s and they're owning a property and have a mortgage and they're starting a family, their concerns may well change over a period of time. But, I mean, in any case, we are, as we sit here today, 10 years on, a long, long way, I suspect, from a second referendum. Who knows what the constitutional terrain will look like in 10 years' time. I think we've given that a good go today.
Well,
and
yeah, I mean, aspects of this we will doubtless return to, because, the Constitution is the one thing that absolutely everybody in Scottish politics has strong views on. It remains the dividing fault line, if you like, in Scottish politics. The one subject that is guaranteed to get attention, to get people engaged. And some of that, I suppose, particularly on the Yes side, obviously reflects the fact that it is unfinished business as far as they are concerned. And they enjoyed 2014 and would like to recapture some of that magic in a future plebiscite. For the No campaign, on the other hand, that is a box that must be nailed shut over and over and over again. And there is no room for complacency. Vigilance is the union's watchword, if you like, because they have no desire to return to these questions. And that, I think, explains how, there is a sort of rebarbative approach to unionism now in certain respects that is much more polarized, much harsher, uglier in certain respects than was the case in 2014. There is a profound distrust, dislike, even hatred of people like Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon on the No side now that is much sharper, much more obvious than was the case even in 2014. That isn't particularly healthy. At the same time, there is no sign of the Yes campaign accepting that, a referendum has to have meaning. Otherwise, what's the point of the referendum? And so we continue in this sort of sense of Scotland as an unsettled nation forever in search of an ending. And I'm not sure, even though, things are pretty bleak for the SNP right now, that doesn't mean that the Yes tide can't return at some future date. But at the moment, yes, you're right that they're in trouble. But it would be a mistake, nevertheless, to assume that this question won't arise again in the future.
Well, we're in search of an ending. In fact, we've found our ending. But just to say to folk, if you want to get in touch, it's ponsonbymassey@gmail.com, at ponsonbymassey on X. And as Alex says, we will come back to some of the themes that we've been chewing over this morning many times in the future. But for this episode, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.